All right, welcome to the fifth screencast for Chapter 6. In this screencast, we're going to talk about something called the deadweight loss from taxes. And what it's going to be, just to kind of look ahead, is it's going to be consumer and producer surplus that goes away when taxes are placed on items. And it's not going to be the revenue that goes to the government. We know that part of the surplus will go to the government. That's why they tax. But actually part of it will just kind of evaporate. All right. So just to remind you about tax incidents, this kind of summarizes the last screencast. If a tax is levied on a business, the firm will attempt to raise prices to pass some of the burden to consumers. If the tax is levied on consumers, some of the burden is passed to producers since the market price falls. All right. And we said the incidence of the tax is who actually pays the tax. So whether the tax is levied on the producer or consumer, the end incidence turned out to be the same. All right, you can go back and watch that previous screencast and see that we put a dollar tax on the buyers, we put a dollar tax on the sellers, and it ended up being they both paid the same amount of the tax. It turned out to be half-half in both cases. It's not always going to be half-half, and we'll get to that in a minute. So on the previous graphs, the tax had a price and a quantity effect, right? The price changed. The equilibrium price was not the price buyers paid and sellers received. There was a separation between what buyers paid and sellers received, and the government got that the dollar in the milk example, and it also had an effect on quantity. All right, the prices increased and the quantity transacted decreased. All right, so there were transactions that would have happened had there been no tax that now no longer happen, right? So there was gain to be made, right? Those buyers were willing to pay at the market price. Those sellers were willing to sell at the market price, all right? But because there's now a difference between the market, what buyers pay and sellers receive, there's going to be transactions that just do not happen. This is called the deadweight loss of a tax. It's a cost to society in the form of less economic welfare resulting from the tax. All right, it's caused by the decrease in the amount of trade that actually occurs. Those transactions that formerly buyers would have gained, sellers would have gained, they now don't happen. All right. Now, some of this loss to consumers and producers is the revenue that goes to the government. All right, but there are these transactions that just don't happen. So the government doesn't get revenue for those. The consumers don't get consumer surplus. And the producers don't get producer surplus. They're just gone, and that's what we call the deadweight loss of a tax, all right? And it's easier for me to think of it graphically, so let's do it again. Let's do the tax on buyers again. Price without the tax is $4. We're going to levy the tax legally on the buyers, which means it shifts the demand curve down by the amount of the tax. So again, we're shifting down $1, the entire demand curve, all right? That means we get a new intersection of supply and demand. That's the price for the other side, not the one that shifted. That's the price sellers receive. Buyers pay. You just add the tax to what sellers receive. Buyers receive $4.50. Right? That's what we did in the last screencast. All right. Here again, the incidence is evenly split. All right. We'll see in the next screencast that it's not always. But notice these transactions, this 2,500 transactions, are no longer going to happen. All right. So that's what we call the deadweight loss of a tax. All right. So this is the consumer surplus now. The area below the demand curve, above the price buyers pay, is their consumer surplus. This triangle is the producer surplus, the area below the price sellers receive and above the supply curve, their willingness to pay. This rectangle is the revenue the government gets. The government gets $1 times ever how many are sold. But this is deadweight loss. This is just a loss to everyone. The government doesn't get it, producers don't get it, and sellers don't get it. It's just gone. It evaporates. Let's look at it on the seller side. All right. So here again, I'm going to put the tax on the sellers. So that means the supply curve shifts up by $1. All right. We get a new intersection of supply and demand, which is actually the price for the other side, not the one that shifted. This is the price buyers pay. It's $4.50. To find what sellers receive, you just subtract the amount of the tax. Sellers receive $3.50. Notice the incidence, again, is evenly split here. So where is consumer surplus? Well, it's the area under the demand curve, the willingness to pay curve, if you will. Above the price buyers pay, this is consumer surplus, this triangle. Producer surplus is the area below the price sellers receive above the supply curve, this triangle. All right. The government revenue is this triangle here. It's the amount of the tax times the number of units they sell, this area. And then this area is that deadweight loss. It's just gone. Those transactions, formerly buyers wanted to buy, formerly sellers wanted to sell, they would have gained. It's now gone. It just evaporates. It does not happen. So that's the deadweight loss of this excise tax. So now we're going to talk about elasticity and tax incidence. All right. So the tax incidence is the same no matter who the tax is levied on. We know that. All right. But it's not always equally split between buyers and sellers. All right. So what determines the incidence then? Well, it turns out to be elasticity. The elasticity of demand and supply will determine the tax incidence. All right. The more inelastic side will pay more of the tax. The more inelastic you are, usually the less substitutes you have, the less options you have. So you end up shouldering more of the burden for the tax. You still have to buy the good. You're more inelastic. You are less responsive to price changes. So you end up paying more of the tax. All right. So let's think about elasticity and deadweight loss now. Why would the government want to tax a good with very inelastic demand? All right. Well, there are no substitutes, so that ensures a steady tax revenue. The amount of purchases will not change very much if you tax an inelastically demanded good. All right. So if the good is perfectly inelastic, then their number of goods they buy won't change at all, and there won't actually be a deadweight loss. So the more inelastic the good is demanded, the less deadweight loss there is. The more elastic the suppliers and demanders are, the more deadweight loss there is. So remember, that's because own price elasticity is how responsive quantity demand and quantity supplied are to price changes. A tax is an increase in price. All right. So the more elastic they are, if you put the tax up even a little, lots of people aren't going to stop buying it. All right. They're very sensitive to price. All right. So let's see what this looks like graphically. All right. So here is the quantity of phone service before the tax, and here's after the tax. All right. So we're going to have perfectly inelastic demand. All right. So everybody's got to have a phone. So we're going to be looking at just the market for phone service overall. So it's very inelastically demanded. So a perfectly inelastic demand curve is a straight up vertical line like this. All right. So there's an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. Now let's place the tax. Oh, so here's consumer surplus and here is producer surplus. Consumer surplus is the area above the price up to the demand curve. Of course, the demand curve is vertical, so it could keep going as high as we wanted to draw this. The producer surplus is the area below the price above the supply curve. All right. So now let's look at it with a tax, and we're going to put the tax on the sellers here. So if I tax the sellers, the supply curve shifts up. I get a new price. Whose price is that? That's the price the buyers pay. Notice the price the sellers receive remains the same. That's because the entire incidence of this tax will be borne by the demand side because they are perfectly inelastic. All right. So the supply, the sellers can push all of the increased price onto the buyers because the buyers are very, very inelastic demanders. All right. Government likes this because there is a lot of tax revenue. They didn't lose any revenue. They can increase this again and they wouldn't lose any revenue. All right. Normally there's a deadweight loss, but for a perfectly inelastically demanded good, there is no deadweight loss because the quantity of transactions did not change. All right, all of the transactions that happened before the tax are now happening with the tax. Now, the consumer surplus gets smaller because consumers are paying all of the tax revenue, but the producer surplus actually stays the same. Producers still get everything above, below the price down to their supply curve. All right. So here's what a deadweight loss looks like with a somewhat elastic demand curve. All right. So before the tax, after the tax. So here we have demand that is somewhat elastic. You know, it was perfectly inelastic before. Now it's somewhat elastic, kind of the middle case. All right. We've already seen this case before with our milk. So consumer surplus, producer surplus. Now I'm going to put the tax on the buyers again. So the supply curve shifts up. All right. This gives us a new price at the intersection. Whose price is it? It's the buyer's price. Buyers pay P2. Sellers receive P3. The difference between them is the tax. The government receives this revenue. All right. Consumers surplus is the area below the demand curve, above the price they pay. Producer surplus is the area below the price down to the original supply curve. Producer surplus, they get this. Consumer surplus, they get this. The government gets this. What's this lonely triangle here? That is the deadweight loss of this tax. So this one has a deadweight loss. So when we had perfectly inelastic demand, we didn't have deadweight loss. But as long as both suppliers and demanders have some elasticity, neither one is perfectly inelastic, then we will get a deadweight loss of the tax. Now let's look at a third case with perfectly elastic demand. All right. So before the tax, demand for perfectly elastic demand is a flat line, the demand curve. So we have a price, we have an equilibrium quantity, and producers get all of the surplus. When demand is perfectly elastic, the price that prevails is at the willingness to pay for every consumer. All right. So the producer surplus is here. There's not really any consumer surplus. They're all buying just at their willingness to pay. All right. So now what happens when I put a tax on this good? So we're going to again put a tax on the sellers. So we shift up the supply curve by the amount of the tax. The new equilibrium price, notice, is the same. The price that sellers pay is the same, but the price buyers receive is much lower. It's lower by the amount of the tax. All right. So because demanders are perfectly elastic, the suppliers end up paying all of the tax. All right. So that tax revenue goes to the government. This is the producer surplus, and this is the deadweight loss of that tax. All right. Consumers still don't get any surplus, but all of the loss in total surplus, which is only producer surplus here, is borne by the producer side. And that's this deadweight loss. And this hunk goes to the government in terms of government revenue. So we have to balance this deadweight loss against the need for tax revenue. It's a real loss. No one gets it. It's just an evaporation of welfare of consumers and producers. And it's not like the government is actually getting it to do anything with it. It's just gone. All right. So we have to ask things like, what is the purpose of a tax? Is it to gain revenue for the government, or is it to decrease production or consumption of a good? Maybe because of a negative externality, which we're going to talk about later on in the semester. Maybe we're trying to reduce pollution or something like that. So in Ireland in 2002, they put a 15-cent tax on plastic bags. The purpose was to curb litter and to encourage recycling. Plastic bag use fell by over 90%. All right. So they didn't probably raise a whole lot of revenue with this, but they did have a big change in the behavior. People responded in a big way to the use of plastic bags. All right, so now let's look at this graphically. We've looked at some extreme cases where we had perfectly inelastic demand, we had kind of medium demand, medium elastic demand, and then we had perfectly elastic demand. Let's look at kind of a middle case here. So here we have, this is going to be the market for mushrooms, and so we're going to have demand and supply here, and we're going to have an equilibrium $7 for the price, equilibrium quantity of 1,000 pounds of mushrooms. All right. So I'm going to come in and we're going to put a tax on the buyers, all right, of $3. All right. So again, this shifts the supply curve up by $3, and so we will get a new price at the intersection of supply and demand. This is going to be the price that the buyers pay. All right. And we're going to get a new equilibrium quantity at 700. How much do the sellers receive? We drop down from what the buyers pay, the amount of the tax, which is $3, and we get to $5, and that's the amount of the tax increase. All right. So where is the tax revenue? Well, the tax revenue is all of this. So they get $3. The government gets $3 times the number of goods that are actually still transacted. So they get $3 times 700. So they would get $2,100. Where is the consumer surplus? Well, it's the area above the price they pay, below the demand curve. Where is the producer surplus? Well, it's the area above the old supply curve, under the price that they pay. That's their producer surplus still. And then what is this over here? This is the deadweight loss. So notice that more of this deadweight loss comes from the producer side. All right. So where was the producer surplus before? Well, it was this triangle. That was the old producer surplus. Notice how much of the deadweight loss comes from that. Where was the old consumer surplus? That was this triangle. Notice how little of the deadweight loss comes from their side. Why is it that the suppliers, the producers, are paying more? Well, look, you can tell that this demand curve is more elastic than this supply curve, all right? Either of the supply curves. Suppliers are more inelastic, and the more inelastic party bears more of the burden of the tax. They don't bear all of it unless they're perfectly inelastic, but they bear more of it, all right? So it's the relative elasticity of the supply and demand that determines which side bears more of the tax, all right? If they have equal elasticities, elasticity of supply and elasticity of demand are the same, then they'll split the tax, the burden, all right? If the demanders are perfectly inelastic, then they will bear all of it. If suppliers are perfectly inelastic, they will bear all of it. So it depends on the relative elasticity of the groups. So just to summarize what we've talked about here in the excise taxes, the total welfare is the same whether a tax is levied on the customer or the producer. A tax on a good with inelastic demand or supply generates the maximum amount of revenue and the least amount of deadweight loss. The deadweight loss of a tax is larger when demand and supply are more elastic. The incidence of a tax is determined by the relative elasticity between supply and demand. The more inelastic party is the one who bears more of the burden of the tax.